No? Okay, hello everybody, we'll get started. Yes, okay, all right, hi. Hi, thank you very much for coming to today's keynote by our own Dr. Aggie Hirst. I really hope you've been getting a lot out of the conference for the last 2 days, and this is the final event of today, and the time when we like to have an opportunity to give you a sense of what we're doing at King's and what the research program is like here and the activity of the scholars that we have in the King's Wargaming Network, and kind of a moment to reflect on that kind of academic side of wargaming, which we're still very much the junior partner in the relationship in the community of practice. So Aggie today is going to be talking about some of the research derived from her book, The Politics of Play, and I just want to take a moment to sort of situate where that work is. Aggie is a reader here in the department. She's one of the founding members of the King's Wargaming Network way back in 2017, and is really one of the intellectual leaders, not only in King's, unambiguously, but in the world of academic wargaming, in that she's been published in a number of different venues. And I think crucially here, for what it matters for those of you in the room who care about these things, in non-wargaming spaces, right? A part of making wargaming an academically respectable discipline is talking to wider academic disciplines, and that actually makes the bar harder to jump because it's even more alien. And so she's published in a number of journals, and most recently her Politics of Play was published at Oxford University. I had the good fortune of being one of the discussants in our book launch a couple of months ago, and it was really a very interesting read and a super interesting discussion, and Aggie's not going to be able to touch on, I think, half or even a fifth or a quarter or an eighth or a 20th of the stuff in her work. But I just want to make a few comments quickly by way of introduction. This is an extremely accessible, extremely holistic book about wargaming. It comes at it in so many different angles. In many ways, it's the kind of academic book you don't really see anymore, in that rather than really narrowly focusing on just one perspective or one argument, it really kind of ranges across a number of different ideas and ties them together in the way of understanding what's going on when we're wargaming. It is also a really wonderful outsider perspective in that Aggie is not a wargamer. She's a wargame scholar, but it's really interesting how those eyes look on the practice. Some key contributions in this book, without hopefully spoiling Aggie's thought, but I just want to give you a sense of what you can get if you crack this open. There is a fascinating discussion about the Apollonian versus the Dionysian ideas of what we're doing when we're playing. The Apollonian idea of games as locations where players are trying to discover something, a kind of a reason-moderated intellectual world, but also the Dionysian world of a game as a place where you discover something about yourself, a sort of more frenzied, disordered world. This is a discussion Aggie goes at in length in her book, and it's really, very interesting. It also offers her own unique perspective as a third way of understanding what's going on when we're possibly playing in war games, as a deconstructive way of playing, where we're challenging the hierarchies and the power structures we're experiencing in the games. Some of the other stuff that is discussed in this book is how games are part of the production and understanding of the realities we live. A really interesting discussion and pushback on the idea that the hyper-reality of games generate critical thinking, and in fact might be a sort of immersive form of persuasion that dulls the senses and makes you more amenable to other people's arguments or interpretations of the world. So very much a different way of thinking about what this is doing when we think about it. And even a really interesting discussion about why people play, rather than thinking that people are playing to discover something. A really fascinating discussion of how play is a place where you go to seek a void, to be essentially separated from everything and not have to think about anything. So that's just the taste of the kind of stuff you get in this book, and I cannot recommend it enough. It is a rich and unconventional book. It is layered, and it is suggestive of dozens of possible research programs. And it is, in fact, one of the strongest testaments that research into wargaming is in a vibrant and unambiguously productive and generative phase. This is not a dead place. This is a very alive place with questions so much waiting to be answered. It provides a wonderful model for those scholars who wish to write in this area. And if you come out the other side of this book not thinking about what war games are, why engage with them, and what we expect from them, you haven't been reading it right. So with that all said, I'd like to turn it over to Aggie and let her share her thoughts with you.
Thank you very much indeed. Gosh, if only I can live up to any of those claims, I shall be very happy indeed. Thank you very much indeed for coming. It's lovely to see so many people here at this somewhat graveyard shift end of the day. I'm sure you're looking forward to the reception, so I'll try not to keep you too long as we head into the festivities. Huge thank you to Davey, to Anna, for everybody for all their hard work on Wargaming Week and for inviting me to give this keynote talk on, as Davey says, my recently published book, Politics of Play, Wargaming with the US military. So I've been working on this topic since about 2017, so it really has been quite a marathon, not a sprint. Lucky enough to get some funding along the way from the folks at the Leverton Trust and the British Academy, for whom I sincerely thank their support. And what I've tried to do, in addition to some of the more philosophical elements of the book that Davies mentioned, is also sort of build up a new data set of interview materials with the goods and the greats of the US military wargaming community. So I've been hanging out on military bases, I've been chasing people around their various work institutions, schoolhouses, been lucky enough to be invited into some X's, some CPX's, some games, some simulations, and so on. Davey has kindly outed me at the beginning. I'm not actually myself a wargames practitioner, but I'm of the view that one does not need to be. Actually, wargames, I think we are moving beyond the space of simply advocacy, simply them being embraced by those who enjoy them or who are sort of natural or intuitive gamers. And actually, we're lending ourselves to, and I think appealing now to an audience much, much broader. You need not be a gaming enthusiast, I argue, to find games absolutely fascinating. Hence the reason I've spent the better part of the last decade getting lost in this material. What I try to do as an international relations scholar is make two key interventions in my field. What I want to do first is to shift the focus away from recreational gaming, video games and the like, about which there is a nascent literature already, and focus on military gaming. Quite surprisingly, when I started chasing people around in 2017, 2018, started doing the literature review, I expected to find a wealth of material on this topic. But as many of you here in the audience can attest, there really hasn't been a lot of work done as yet. So lucky me to have found a somewhat open goal there to do some work in. But what I also want to do, as Davey said, is to introduce the study of play to international relations. To my mind, if you want to understand games and gaming, you need to understand something about play. So I'm going to dig into that a little bit as we go through. So I've been lucky enough to get a few of these publications out in the last years. If anyone is interested, I'll be very happy to send through copies. They're all available through the usual channels with the likes of Security Dialogue, International Studies Quarterly, International Political Sociology, Brief International Studies, and so on. But the main output, or the most substantive output from this project, is my book, Politics of Play, Wargaming with the US Military, published last year. Now, this is the first scholarly book that maps the first decade of the wargaming renaissance, beginning, of course, in 2014 in the US military. What it does is try to combine a new theory of play with this new data set of interview material that I've generated with the wargaming community of practice. What I argue in a nutshell, although I will expand on this in some detail shortly, is that wargames are increasingly a crucial artifact in the production of warfighters today. So, where does this begin? Well, the publication date happened to fall really almost exactly a decade after, where people tend to identify the beginning of this renaissance. The DoD-wide memos from Secretary of Defense Bob Work and, Chuck Hagel and Deputy Bob Work, calling for a renewed, revivified wargaming effort across the defense establishment. So taking this as the kind of initial prompt, what I have been asking is the question of how games and play have been operationalized in this decade as tools of war making, as tools of warfighter subjectification. How are they used, in other words, through the life cycle of warfighters, from recruitment to training, deployment, and even through to rehabilitation, and with what effects? And what I do in the book is coin a couple of hopefully useful conceptual sort of premises or I don't know, claims in order to try to make this case. So first of all, I argue that we can understand play as a form of pedagogy. I argue in the book that wargaming functions by gaming the cognitive dimension of the subject, of the warfighter, which is associated with attention, iteration, critical thinking, and retention of information. I also draw upon various philosophical and sociological theoretical traditions to think about how games also affect the affective dimension, responsible for feelings, beliefs, assumptions, norms, and thinking about, as Davey says, the politics that go into game design, thinking about how goals are aligned between player and game, thinking about the cultivation of synthetic experience, agency and muscle memory, and a host of topics beyond. So I'm an international relations theorist, an international political theorist by trade and by training, so I like to ground things in confusing theoretical literature as far as possible. And I like to begin my discussion here with the work of Jean Baudrillard, who in the 80s and 90s gave us, I think, a very prescient diagnosis of the shift in the really sort of ontological fabric of society, of the postmodern condition. Now, Baudrillard argues, again in a nutshell, that we have moved from an era of representation, which was understood as a relational mode involving an interaction between reality and construct, to an age of what he calls ontologically unitary systems. He says, and I quote, what this amounts to is that the contradictory process of true and false, of real and imaginary, is abolished in this hyperreal logic of montage. Now, in my own field, the well-known scholar James Dederian took up these ideas in the 90s and applied them to the question of military training. He looked beyond games in a combined analysis to exercises, simulations, and games indeed. And he argued, building on Baudrillard, that what we have in this age of these sort of ontologically unitary reality production systems is precisely that, the production of reality, that reality comes to be produced and reproduced through these kinds of activities and products. What I try to do in the book is build upon this and go a step further. My interest, my argument here is if we take games disaggregated from simulations and exercises with which they're often conflated, they actually work not just to produce realities, but actually to produce people. They produce identity, subjectivity, and in the case of the military warfighter subjectivity. So how does this work? I will expand on this. I'm just throwing the confusing stuff at you first. I hope you'll forgive me. So how do these ontologically total game systems work to produce military life? What I do in the book is I identify two key drivers. Many of you will have views and your own thoughts about this. But what I argue is that there are two key processes or drivers which are at the heart of this process of subjectification. First of all, I call it for the win, the pursuit of victory conditions. Now notice there that I've emphasized pursuit, because it's not, of course, about the realization of victory conditions. How do we know this? Well, of course, as soon as we win, as soon as we lose, as soon as the game finishes, we don't pack up and go home. We are driven to begin again. We are driven to play something else, to go in another direction. What I argue is that we actually have what I call a system of systemic, iterative irresolution, which makes of games a kind of perpetual motion learning engine through the kind of incentivization but suspension of this sort of site of satisfaction, the end of the game, the resolution. In conjunction with this, I'm fascinated, I know many others are as well, with how immersion plays into this. I argue in the book that we must distinguish between, on the one hand, the flow of immersion, the spell of immersion, and the focus of flow, oftentimes conflated together, but I argue they are distinct. What I suggest is that what we actually see happening is the process of de- and re-subjectification of players through through the suspension of critical reflexivity under conditions of immersion. This, again, I will break down, so do forgive me. So, to come back to something a bit more concrete and then to sort of zoom out again. What I'm asking is the role of play in the military's deployment of games in this context. What I argue in the book is that it is much less important what we play and much more important how we play. I argue that we have to think much more critically about who we are and how we are when we engage in gaming artifacts. What I wager is that play, in fact, can be deployed as a really productive and powerful mode of resistance, which can punctuate the totalized systems of games in the ways that I've described. So as Davey mentions, what I do is do a deep dive into the philosophies and theories around play, first of all tracing the Apollonian and the Dionysian, and then thinking about a third way, building on the thought of Jacques Derrida, another confusing French philosopher. And what I argue is that through a deconstructive play mode, we can actually begin to push at and create fractures in the totalized or enclosed logic of games. I suggest some concrete ways we can do this by disentangling play from games, by cultivating a different form of player subjectivity and operationalizing this in the game worlds within which we play. So, I will try to make a little bit clearer what I've just said. Here is an idea of how the book is organized. I begin by digging into the quagmire, really, of what a wargame is. No consensus about this. The more people you talk to, the more definitions you get. So I try to weigh on that debate and try to suggest some kind of principles and parameters by which we might sort of identify what wargaming is and does. In the second chapter, I then trace the kind of evolution of this renaissance, starting with Bob Work and Chuck Hagel, and coming through to the later period within which this process took place, thinking about the third offset strategy and the defense, definitely, I can't remember what it's called now. Yes, the various policies that came through at that time. Defense Innovation Initiative, there we go, it's in there somewhere. So I spend those first two chapters kind of carving out and substantiating where we're at with wargaming and what it is that we're actually talking about. What I do from there is a really deep dive into philosophies and theories of games. So I, perhaps not very sensibly, try to do a genealogy of play from the pre-Socratics, from Heraclitus, through to modern philosophy, and then chapter 4 develop my own kind of postmodern understanding and theorization of play, offering a third way which I hope allows us to get at some of these political questions more substantively. What I do then is shift back to the empirics. So I try to substantiate and explore this question of play as pedagogy. How does play work to produce warfighter subjectivity by intervening in play as cognitive realms? And then I do the same, thinking about the ways in which games affect the affective dimension, identity, values, beliefs, and so on. And I tackle Gadamer's very powerful challenge that actually all playing is a being played, that actually it is the game that masters the player, and not the other way around as we conventionally understand. I then spend the final two chapters tracing and trying to substantiate this idea that there are these two key drivers. First of all, this pursuit but never attainment of this win condition, and secondly, this suspension of critical reflexivity under conditions of immersion. So, I'll take a breather there myself. Where to begin, having said all of that? Let's start where I do in chapter 1, which is this question of what a war game is. As you'll know, sometimes war games are conflated with simulations, with exercises, with a host of other kinds of activities. But I think it's quite important to be able to ring fence and separate out what a war game is, because it does some quite specific things. There are, of course, debates between the sort of relative virtues and vices of manual versus digital games, and we have various debates about the relationship between commercial and military games and how they're drawn into professional military education and warfighter production as well. We have debates, of course, around the questions of deterministic and open-ended forms of games, and there are going to be different implications here around process and product games and how we analyse those. And of course, as we all know, there are a whole range of purposes to which war games are put in the military context. We have research games, games for analysis, experimentation, teaching, training, and all the rest of it. Now, one of the things I argue in the book is that actually we misunderstand, I think, or perhaps overstate some of the differences here between research games and analysis games and teaching and training games. I follow Ralph Costa here when he makes the claim that all games are edutainment. The reason I say this is I think we are really only at the very beginning of beginning to figure out how war games teach people. I really do think that there are many, many more layers than we can actually currently identify. You go to a CPX, you go to a war game, and you can see all of these processes taking place. And I'm not sure even sponsors, designers themselves are quite clear on who is learning what is being absorbed, what is being taken away. What we do know is that these do have pedagogical effects beyond the intended pedagogical or learning outcomes. So why use wargaming in the US military? You talk to the community of practice and they give you a number of very compelling reasons. The axiomatic claim, of course, being that wargaming saves lives. We talked a bit about this yesterday. Among other reasons to use wargaming, it's cost effective, it's replicable, it's safe to learn and safe to fail. It draws on and cultivates the interest of the so-called digital native generation. The argument goes that it increases attention and retention of information. It introduces fun and enjoyment into the training environment. You talk to military people, they don't tend to associate training with fun, but gaming can actually furnish this possibility. A whole host of multiple side benefits as well: unit cohesion, diplomacy, a range of transferable skills. But you start to dig into the literature on this and to speak with some practitioners in this space. And you then quickly have to start asking, I think, questions about agency. Questions about what's happening to the learner, to the soldier in this case, or the warfighter, as these processes take place. Because you oftentimes hear sort of questions or possibilities around things like offloading the cognitive burden or cultivating performance before competence. And from an educator's point of view, I think this really does prompt us to think and ask some serious questions. As my very excellent colleague Debbie Lyle put it in another conference setting, she asked the question, where do we go when we play? And this question has really been animating this research. If we are suspended, if our critical faculties are to some degree suspended under conditions of immersion, then what is the nature of the learning taking place, and where is the agency of the learner subject under those conditions? So, oftentimes the wargaming community of practice will talk about this in terms of Bloom's taxonomy of learning domains, as Roman and Brown have put it. Simply, wargaming is a cost-effective means to provide experience-based learning with emphasis and increasingly the affective training domains. So what am I getting at here? So as far as I've been able to deduce through my interviews by engaging with the military community on here, one of the to try to distill down the rationale for using wargames, it always has to do with learning objectives. People emphasize, of course, that games are never played for their own sake. They're always played for a specific purpose, whether it's teaching, training, whatever the activity in question may be. And the reason to use a game is that in some way or another, the learning objectives are going to be coded into it. In the form of the pursuit of victory conditions, it could be a result that involves winning or not losing or losing under X conditions and so on. But the point is, it's the learning objectives here that is the criterion of success. And seeking out deeper and longer lasting states of immersion and suspending trainees in various kinds of attention gripping experiences are emphasized as very helpful to that end. But my argument is that a focus on efficacy really does elide quite important questions here. What are the effects on players when they are recruited, taught and trained using gaming artifacts? What are the politics of using ostensibly unserious, unreal artifacts to cultivate real-world lethal force? I'm not sure it's something that we have explored and interrogated as a community sufficiently. So, here's where I want to start talking a bit about play, partly because I think it's absolutely fascinating and actually brings a little bit of levity into an otherwise rather kind of bleak world at this present time. But also because I think actually a way into understanding how these kinds of games work pedagogically is to think about them not as play, but perhaps as contradistinctive to play. So let me explain what I mean. I think we need to draw a distinction, quite a significant separation, in fact, between games and play. Oftentimes we think of them as one and the same because we play games. In fact, in some languages, European languages, they're treated, the words for them is the same, spiel, jeu, so on. But I want to draw a distinction, and the distinction is the following one. Play, I think we should understand as an exploratory human capacity or ability. A game, on the other hand, is something like a system or a structure which apprehends and directs play. So in this understanding, play is a kind of generative exploratory force, and a game somehow encloses it, directs it, or kind of applies it to a certain task, a certain purpose, a certain training objective, perhaps in this case. So in the case of using games as teaching or training tools, I'm suggesting that we are harnessing play for particular ends, and I think this is true whether we're using games in a civilian or a military context. So what I'm arguing here is that all war games, in fact, teach their players something, whether it's educationally oriented or not. And so I want to challenge this conventional distinction between educational and analytic games. So let's dig a bit further into play. Why do I keep going on about play? As I say, I think if we're going to understand a bit more about games, we need to look further into play. Now, when we start to research play, you find very quickly that it's really singled out as frivolous, as juvenile, as something that is the preserve of animals, of children. It's what adults do on their downtime. It's what we do when we're not busy with work, with real life. It's where we go to escape, perhaps. But scholars of play emphasize that it is, in fact, vital in a number of senses, vital for life, an essential category of existence. It's how we grow, it's how we learn, it's how we socialize. One of my favorite definitions is simply that play is what makes life lifey. And I think those people, people who enjoy games and gameplay, I think hopefully get something of what that means. Without play, in other words, life is just survival. This very eloquent definition, I think, it's followed up by a discussion of how the opposite of play is not seriousness, but the opposite of play is depression. It's where life has lost its luster. But it's also very difficult to study, and that's because it's extremely kind of ontologically unstable. Play is both truth and illusion, it's both real and non-real, it's both phenomenon and subjectivity. It can be understood as a behavior, as an action, as an attitude, experience, an existential condition, and much beyond. One of the really interesting examples, I think, if you've read Bateson's analysis here, is that it's a very powerful form of communication, but also of meta-communication, by which he means that it communicates not just what it explicitly says and does, but it communicates something else about what it explicitly says and does. He uses the example of wolf cubs who are able to communicate through play to one another, with the difference between a bite for real and a play bite. And this is something that we can understand in terms of our own childhoods, the exploratory sort of playing with something, being able to communicate that this is a play version of the thing. Play is highly absorbing. People call it autotelic, meaning that it is for its own sake. We don't play for any other purpose but the play itself. But it also comes along with an interesting series of kind of existential changes. Play, scholars have suggested, comes along with a kind of diminished sense of self, that when you're in play or at play, you become somehow self-forgetful. You become less kind of worried about the specifics of your real life, of the serious business of reality. It exists in its own spatial and temporal zones, in and outside of reality, and it has this self-renewing desire to continue. Play is kind of auto-regenerative. As Csikszentmihalyi puts it, it's something that is for its own sake and it's an end in itself, although he is keen to point out can be harnessed for extrinsic ends. This is something we might think about in terms of wargaming itself. So can play save the day here? Should we be looking to play as the kind of antidote to the rather sort of, seriousness of life and some of the kind of more depressing elements of our current political situation? I really do recommend to you a book called Against Flow, written by Braxton Soderman, where he tries to interrogate this kind of question of immersion, but more specifically, thinking about the flow, the place of flow in our culture today, in the wellness industry, in gaming and beyond. And he argues that actually we cannot simply turn to play to sort of solve the problems of the contemporary moment. It has been argued that play will save the day, relieving us from the kind of dehumanizations and violences of modern life. But Soderman argues that it is not enough to liberate play from games, because the former is in part neoliberalism's attention economy, functioning to prevent us from noticing capitalism's teeth in our necks. He diagnoses that we in fact live in an era of playful capitalism, that play has actually been kind of absorbed into the status quo and hence cannot help us escape it. Can play save the day then? I think Soderman puts this very interestingly, and I agree with him to a point, but I spend the last chapter of the book suggesting why I think his analysis is limited. So, I'll quote him. He says the following: "The absorbing and enjoyable properties of flow align with capitalism and its mobilization of enjoyment to sustain consumption, reflecting capitalism's dynamic adjustment of our desires to the rhythms of its streams of consumption. Games are designed to capture our attention while keeping us playing and paying." Play, he says, is thus implicated in and is indissociable from the kind of enclosures of political apathy and neoliberal capitalism. But I don't think that's the end of the story. I think we can do more with play than simply lament its enclosure in the political realities and establishments of our time. So, I try to defend this position as robustly as I can. Some people, I think, are quite interested in the extensive philosophical dimensions of this. Others perhaps may skip those chapters in the book, and that's entirely fair enough. But what I try to suggest is that actually if we look at the kind of evolution of play through our historical philosophical canon, we can find out some quite interesting things about how play might be used as a politically productive way of thinking about this. So, what I tried to do is develop a genealogy of play, starting from the ancient traditions, the pre-Socratic traditions in Heraclitus, and I follow Mechthild Nagel when she diagnoses what's called a malediction of play through Western philosophy. So we start out with play being aligned with the kind of the Greek gods. It's anarchic, it's subject producing, it's kind of disordered, exciting, all of that kind of good stuff. But what we see is this sort of domestication of play through the philosophical traditions, from Plato and Aristotle themselves, through the German idealist tradition, and it's not until Nietzsche comes along and shakes things up a bit that we see the return of anarchic play. What I want to suggest is that this gives us a fundamentally useful but limited kind of bifurcation of understanding of play. So I'll skip forward a little bit for purposes of time, so that we have some time for discussion. But what I want to suggest is that, drawing on the thought of Jacques Derrida, what we can do is think about a third way of play, what I call deconstruction as play, deconstructive play. So what deconstructive play is going to do is that it inherits from the Dionysian tradition its emphasis on free play, on process over order, on the idea of subjectivity as a process of becoming. But it integrates ongoing mechanisms and demands for greater reflexivity. What I want to suggest is that we should move away from Nietzsche's kind of playful hero-warrior and towards a kind of more auto-deconstructive player-subject. So again, the question here is not about so much what we play, but how we play. What kinds of critical dispositions are we bringing to our play experiences? Now, the reason I suggest this is I think this enables us not to wait around for more progressive forms of game design, but actually to exercise our critical and philosophical and political reflexivity in any and all gaming artifacts. So a retheorization of play, I'm not usually one for tables, but here is one just to sort of try to capture what it is that I've done for this purpose. So that kind of covers the more philosophical side of things, but let's turn it back to wargaming, and let's think about how this process, again, has been working in the production of warfighters. What I want to do is use this kind of critical deconstructive play ethos to critically examine how play is working in the production of warfighters, as I've said. So I identify these two key drivers, the first of which is this idea of for the win, the pursuit of victory conditions, or not losing conditions, or whatever it is. Again, it's not about outcome, it's about process, it's about kind of pursuit. So, talking to people in the community of practice, people seem very clear that players must play to win. You can't really get much out of a war game, you can't get a war game to teach you much or to generate any useful results if players are disinterested. It's fairly easy to realise, people say, because winning, of course, is fun. Part of why people like games is that it feels good. It feels good to be doing well, it feels good to be kind of succeeding or winning over your adversary, whatever they may be. You talk to people in the military as well, and they often sort of single out or identify winning as being really key to military socialization. We're a community of winners, we're a community of type A's, we're people who are natural kind of winners in that sense. And of course, in the military, winning has pretty high stakes there. It's interesting because in the community of practice, it's often framed as a kind of natural or spontaneous quality that people have. But again, I think we can see it as something a bit more political, something that is more cultivated. But what I think is really important here is the question of what do players think is happening when they're pursuing victory conditions. They're presented with a game, they are in good faith expected to engage with it seriously and to play to win. But players oftentimes think that the outcome is important, right? They think that you have to play to win and the win somehow means something. It seems to me to be the case that actually it's oftentimes irrelevant. The point of the war game is not ultimately who wins or loses, it's what you learn along the way. And this has this capacity, I think, to generate this kind of perpetual motion learning machine that people, because the sort of implied or the promised resolution never quite arrives, what you do is you kind of cultivate this repetitive process of learning, which keeps people gripped, which engages people inside and outside of the classroom, as people were talking about yesterday. And then secondly, I argue that basically this is driven, in addition, by these processes of immersion and flow. As I said, my excellent colleague Debbie Lyle posed this question quite simply but quite effectively of where do we go when we play? Where is the subject in play? Are you still yourself when you are at play? No worries. People talk about the pleasure of games being associated with the experience of immersion. And there's a very interesting literature on this in terms of the experience of immersion from a sort of psychological or subjective perspective. One of the most pleasurable elements of being immersed is that the kind of inner critic is switched off. That you are not thinking about what you're doing. You are in a very sort of pleasing feedback loop of action, reaction. You are fully invested in this process. And there's a temporal dimension to this as well. Simon Parkin calls it chronoslip. We've all had that experience, I'm sure, of playing a game and, you know, suddenly you come to and it's 3 in the morning and you're hungry and tired and disorientated and, you know, or a week has passed or something like that. And I think, again, this is incredibly kind of exciting and important, but also important that we ask questions about the power of that highly absorbing state. But of course, the experience of immersion is a fragile one, is a delicate one. Immersion can be broken. We can come bumping back down to earth and realize we are, you know, cold and shivering and, you know, haven't eaten in 3 days with a bump in that regard. So the idea here is, again, following Csikszentmihalyi, that wargaming helps cultivate a kind of flow state in which there is a sort of ideal combination or intersection of arousal and an efficacy or skill. Csikszentmihalyi, you know you're a games researcher when you learn how to pronounce this chap's name. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi says that flow is an optimal state of consciousness, a peak state where we both feel and perform our best. We become so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. The ego falls away, time flies. Every action, movement, and thought follows inevitably from the previous one, like playing jazz. Your whole being is involved, and you're using your skills to the utmost. Now, of course, this is quite a difficult state to realize, and a fragile one when one does. But the question is, where is the self when at play? Where is the self under conditions of immersion? Paulo Freire, a wonderful scholar of pedagogy, makes the following remark, which really struck me when I read it. He says simply that animals do not consider the world. They are immersed in it. Now, the implication of that seems to be that immersion actually circumvents something of our reflexivity, something of our kind of conscious thinking. Now, the danger with this, of course, and this is where Hans-Georg Gadamer's very interesting analysis comes in, is that the player becomes then the object of the game, not its subject. He puts this, and again, a very powerful quotation when I read it that has stuck with me since. He says simply in Truth and Method, all playing is a being played. The attraction of a game, the fascination it exerts, consists precisely in the fact that the game masters the players. The real subject of the game is not the player, but instead the game itself. What holds the player in its spell, draws him into play and keeps him there, is the game itself. Now, this would seem to really turn on our head the understanding of the relationship between play and game, player and game. We assume that the player is the subject, the hero, the decider, the agent, the one who is in control. But in this reading, what we have is actually a relation of kind of submission to the game. The game masters the player, the game tells the player what to do, the game kind of cultivates the player. And I think, again, as a community, we've not interrogated this possibility as fulsomely as we might. So what is to be done? How do we avoid becoming the passive objects of gameplay? This is why I've been waffling on about play for many hours, because I think that is where the answer lies. How do we avoid becoming passive objects of gameplay? What we do is we break the spell of immersion. We do what designers and facilitators and everybody else says we mustn't do. How might we do this? Well, we prioritize play over the game. We take more seriously this idea of play as an exploratory force, mode or capacity, and we take seriously the idea that a game arrests, directs, or otherwise kind of channels play, and we play more playfully. We play the game more agentially. We play the game thinking through its politics. We game the game. We do fight the scenario. And again, this is why I come to the conclusion that it is not so much what we play that matters, but how we play. I'm not interested in saying X games are good or X games are bad or anything of that kind. The sort of pearl-clutching response to all these things I think doesn't get us very far. But what I would suggest is that it is possible for, and indeed incumbent upon each of us, to think about the question of how we play, what kind of player we are. very interesting literature on this in game studies as well by Arseth and others, thinking about the implied player versus the critical player. Do we simply follow what it is the game incentivizes us to do, or do we take a more kind of challenging and reflexive positionality here? So deconstructive play, what might it look like? Critical thinking and engagement, not the kind of critical thinking that we often hear about in sort of military pedagogical contexts, because oftentimes that's actually much more problem-solving thinking. I'm talking about critical thinking, which is actually much more disruptive, which pushes harder at some of the assumptions that are coded in. We punctuate immersion with critical reflection. We play deconstructively. We keep the play in play, as Derrida might have put it. We treat the game as a text, as an artifact, as something to be read, interrogated, and reflected upon, not simply absorbed and obeyed. We ask, what are its rules? We ask, who designed it and why? We ask whose story is being told, who are the protagonists, who are the antagonists, who are the heroes, who are the villains? What am I being rewarded or punished for doing? What am I being incentivized to do? What are the gendered, racialized, colonial, or other sorts of hierarchical tropes at work? How might we think about modding, hacking, counterludic identities where we might become co-producers of games as opposed to simply their players? So that's what I've been up to for the last many years. The book is out, thank goodness. It means I now can no longer tinker with it, and I've been extremely fortunate to have some lovely responses so far. Notably, just to show off a little bit, from the late great Peter Perler, who said very nice things, as did his co-conspirator, the wonderful Ed McGrady. Both of them I thank very sincerely for these endorsements. It really does mean a great deal. And what's next? The academic wargaming kind of community is obviously still in development. We are a young and a small cluster, but it is growing. So this project has now more or less been wrapped up. I'm now starting a new one. Much like gaming as a perpetual learning machine, so too is research. And I think there is much, much more to be said and done around the academic study of wargaming. So I want to ask the question next of going beyond the war in wargaming. How and where, I'm asking in this new project, are questions of human security in wargames, in simulations, in command post exercises, and so on. I'm interested in thinking about the WPS agenda, around DEI, around women, minorities, civilians, LGBTQIA+, and all sorts of other groups and categories, which oftentimes are left out of being modelled into or treated as key actors in our games. Now, this project has been launched with my excellent colleague, Dr. Paul Kirby, who is a leading WPS scholar based at Queen Mary. But of course, we've launched it in rather strange times. As I alluded to in the opening session of this conference, a lot is changing. A lot is changing very rapidly. My research, my kind of network of wargaming interviewees are largely based in the States. And of course, we are seeing some quite radical changes out there at the current time. We've done some preliminary interviews, which really have been quite different to what it was like trying to research this project. They've been characterized by a good deal of fear, a deal of anger, job losses, cuttings of grants, PhD theses vanishing, and indeed the removal of human security themes from games in a number of contexts. So this is prompting us, my co-researcher and I, to ask the question, are we now seeing what we might call a kind of ebb in what Peter Perler has called the kind of sine wave of popularity that wargaming has been subject to over the decades, at least in the US? And my question to those of us here who are based in Europe, who are based in other places, not the United States, is what do we do? How do we respond to this? If there is going to be a fundamental sea change in the United States, which has conventionally in the last 10 years been leading the kind of wargaming charge, will we follow suit? Will the European powers, powers around the world be jettisoning women, peace and security, jettisoning questions of human security, shifting to kind of models and simulations perhaps, and taking the humans out of the loop? Or will we muster a defense of wargaming as we know it, centering human subjects, centering decision-making, and being mindful of questions of human security in addition to more kinetic forms? For the wider academic community, we have got lots of work to do as well. We are developing an academic subfield of wargames. If we're going to use wargaming seriously, we need to be able to actually defend its use as a methodology, as grounded in certain epistemological claims, and we need to become more rigorous and systematic about this. I have a different view than some that have been viewed or aired in this conference and beyond, I think, that wargaming doesn't have to be constrained by a kind of positivist understanding of science. I think we can be much more pluralistic about it. And as we talked about in the conference as well yesterday, emerging tech and potentials, all sorts of new challenges. People keep asking me about how AI is going to affect wargames, and I have to tell them I have not the first clue because I can't get my brain around it. But the academic community is going to have to, get going on that. Are we going to be encountering AI as a tool which can help us better manage the unmanageable complexity with which we are faced increasingly? Or are we going to end up with a sort of reproductive echo chamber of inherited wisdom, which actually undermines what it is that wargaming can do, which is deal with the messy business of human decision-making and the political world? A final little plug, special offer. You can have the book for 30% off if you would like to. It is out in paperback, so shouldn't break the bank anyway, but you can get it for the bargain price of £13.99 if you use this code. So I'm told by the publisher I must do this, although it's a little bit awkward. That's it for me. Thank you very much indeed. I really appreciate you coming along. Cheers. We certainly can. Yeah, Q&A is certainly part of it, if people want to, or we can go and drink wine. That's also fine.
Well, either way, so sorry for not going to...
Do people have any questions? Would people like to ask questions?
Yeah, so
there are questions.
People to accidentally escape, because we have 10 minutes for Q&A, which would be out, and then we're going to do a quick wrap-up at the end as well.
Lots of hands at the back. I don't know if you want to yell or if there are microphones making their way up.
Is this? Ah.
Hello, hi.
Wonderful. Like using Chomsky's language about kind of a distance from the player becoming kind of the object
right.
Of the game. We've read a lot of the same literature. One of the things I really like your opinion on, because you're eventually going to read my argument. I'm interested to see kind of from your perspective what you think about this, is kind of, do you think seeing the guts of the game, seeing the rules, or even further than, even deeper than that, the guts of the rules, the kind of citations, the data, the mechanical process that informs the rules themselves?
Right.
Do you think that generates kind of the distance and reflection required, right? And that breaks the sort of kind of immersive spell and shows what's going on?
Yeah.
And you think there's kind of optimal or suboptimal ways to do that if you want sort of like the alienated play sort of like options of kind of trying to generate distance?
Right. I think that's a great question. And do you want me to answer right away, or do we want to take a few? Okay. Do you want to take it? Okay, we'll do a few. Cool.
So I think a similar theme. When we talk about war games possibly subverting some of the critical thinking rather than improving it, what do you think are the key mechanisms of wargaming that engage or more disengage that? And then what do you think are responses we can have to removing those difficulties?
Right. Easy one, then.
Is it working? Hi, Aggie. Thanks for the talk. You mentioned about regurgitated wisdom, and looking critically at your own novel. You said that you've written interviews. You've written it based on sort of 100+ hours of interviews with people in the US. Thinking about the diversity potentially of the people that you've interviewed there, to what degree did you get a diverse range of perspectives and viewpoints within that could have affected the book? And based on that, what are your next plans given the information that you have received?
So just the penultimate bit, were you asking about the diversity of who I interviewed, or?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah,
And
okay,
then,
great.
based on that, what you thought about it.
Yeah, great. Yes, great.
I have a very short question. What is not play?
What is?
Not play.
What is not play?
Because everything you seem to describe there is suggests like life is play, everything is play of some sort. So, what is not play?
Good one. I think there's one here. Yeah.
The design of the game can help with immersion, depending on the choices you make. But I'm wondering, do you have any insights into what things the players can do to get better immersed?
Just to add to your growing list of questions, in all the interviews, did you feel that it was all in a vacuum? Was it sort of, you've got the top-down initiative to do this, or the defense initiative? Was it divorced from the wider American society, or did you find links back and forth?
Great. I'm going to have to write things down, otherwise I'll forget. Good. Okay, I mean, these are going to be tricky things to answer. So seeing the guts of the game, and I like that framing because it's kind of gross, but I like it for that reason. My sense is that the closer you can get to becoming a kind of co-architect of the thing, the less you become its object. So that could, but of course that's going to depend on various kinds of skill sets. And this is why when we think about the debates between manual and digital forms of gaming, people oftentimes say, you know, whilst digital has its advantages, the trouble is you have to have such a precise skill set in order to be able to become a tinkerer that takes a lot of people off the table. Whereas actually, you know, whether it's, you know, you have some games almost explicitly oriented around this. The whole Dungeons and Dragons sort of tradition has this sense of, a much greater sense of reciprocity and engagement and the capacity to contest the person creating the rules and those who then follow them. So my sense is, you know, we can think about that figuratively, be like, you know, how do I, by myself in my own space, you know, while playing a game, think more critically about, you know, the instructions I have, the manuals I have. But it can also be done much more practically and collaboratively. And my sense is the further we do this, the more we poke holes in it, not simply to sort of make the training objectives better, but actually so that we know what it is that we're actually doing in the play roles within which we then become kind of inscribed or interpolated. If that makes sense. I'm looking forward to reading the work on it for sure. Subverting and engaging critical play. So this is where I expect a fair amount of pushback from wargamers, yourselves, and many others, because a lot of people want to emphasize that gaming, as compared to other modes or forms of pedagogy, allows much more critical thinking, right? It allows you to explore, it allows you to make decisions. My question is always, within what parameters and under what kinds of constraints? And how can we become more, how can we notice more what's been taken off the table and not just embrace, oh, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 options, so I'm free. And this goes into a whole series of debates about, you know, philosophy of mind, freedom, you know, the whole kind of political thinking thing. So my wager is that it's not that we're throwing wargaming out the window, quite the opposite. It's about saying, how can we take what we already have in terms of the capacity for critical thinking, in terms of what's what's made possible, but actually recognize what's been taken off the table, what's been subverted, and then kick the door down a little bit more, push at those boundaries so that we can think, you know, the more out-of-the-box thinking we can do, the better, right? You know, why would we limit that in advance? I hope that goes some way to what you were asking about. The diversity of interviewees, yes, it was up here. It won't surprise you to learn that it's a fairly monochrome kind of community, and in terms of gender, not especially diverse. That said, there are a number, as everybody will know, of extremely impressive women in wargaming with whom I did a good number of interviews. We have a women wargamers excellent establishment here through DSTL. There's another one out in the States, and they added a different kind of perspective and lens to some of what was being talked about. One of the things that some of my kind of peers, you know, people more in my generation did point out is that I'd interviewed actually quite a lot of the older generation of wargamers rather than the kind of younger people coming through, and that might kind of lend itself, or might be a limitation of the research, which is absolutely fair. One of the things I did notice, it was that the more senior and the more white and male, the freer people felt to speak. Now, I don't know if that's because they found getting permissions easier or if they had less to lose in terms of hedging, but actually where I had people wanting to be off the record, where I had people wanting to be not quoted by name, oftentimes were women and people of color, which I found quite interesting. And I think said something about, you know, and that's going to get, as I've tried to end the talk on today, thinking about the shift in our political kind of moment, you know, I expect that will become even more pronounced as we go forward. Certainly trying to do this research on the women, peace and security agenda and human security, people are very reluctant to be on the record now, particularly women, particularly other groups, which is very difficult to hear. What is not play? What a great question. I don't think play is an ontological state. I don't think it's a kind of black and white situation where you're sort of you're in play or you're out of play or someone is playful or not. I think it's something that can be woven in pretty much everywhere. You know, people give talks in a different style, and some people might be more playful than others. People, you know, go about their daily lives in more or less playful ways. So I don't think it's a kind of is play, isn't play question. I think my question is, A, where can we recognize the play that's already taking place? And B, where can we cultivate more of it? Because if it is what makes life lifey, then fantastic. But I think, as I said before, I think the opposite of play is not seriousness. The opposite of play is depression. The opposite of play is mere survival. So if something isn't play, it's those things, I would say. Design, helping with immersion. So yes, so there are a number of tricks of the trade. Through there's a good literature on this in game studies. I know that many in the wargaming community are interested in this too. You know, there are all sorts of things you can try and cultivate in terms of things like, you know, having players speak of themselves in the first person. You know, if they identify with their character or with their force or whatever it is, you know you've achieved immersion. You can tap into forms of narrative and storytelling. There are a whole host of kind of tricks of the trade. I think for me, the question isn't how can we do more of it? It's how can we kind of challenge what we already have? So I'm coming at it basically from, I think, the other angle. So yeah, I'm not an expert in how to create immersion. I'm becoming an expert, I think, in how to kind of break it. But I know that's not necessarily what people are after. So links to broader society, yes. So one of the things that's been interesting about this book is that it seems to be of interest to people because of the sort of zeitgeist that surrounds it. So we are in this kind of ludic century. Gaming is everywhere. It's in not just entertainment and recreation, but it's in education, it's in health, it's in government, it's all over the place. And it's been really kind of gratifying to have the book land at a time where people are interested. So all sorts of interesting kind of side elements came out of this. I'll just give one example. So one of the papers I wrote was called Video Games Saved My Life, and it was written by a former army, what rank was he? I forget now. I think maybe, not, yeah, sergeant. Anyway, he'd done, or maybe even colonel, no. And he came back from Iraq with PTSD and couldn't leave the house on days where the bin trucks were coming because he was having very difficult feelings, and turned to gaming. And they have, and he is now the architect of an online, well, of a kind of a veterans gaming community that has scores of chapters across the States and beyond. They're called stackup.org. And they use gaming for veteran support, for community building, for suicide prevention, for therapy, and all sorts of kind of applications in that regard. So when I was talking before about gaming from recruitment through to rehabilitation, I find it fascinating to think of that zeitgeist and that kind of, yeah, that full spectrum kind of series of examples. I don't know if that's what you were alluding to, the sort of broader society of...
The actual military wargaming itself. In the past, for example, the weirdest historical thing I know of, pre-First World War, Victorian dinner parties.
Oh yes, absolutely.
I mean, hasn't there been that type of sort of mixing of the military wargaming back into American society?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the crossovers between the video games industry, you know, Call of Duty and that stuff, but actually what you're also seeing, so you're seeing a lot of, and this came up yesterday, gaming that's going on in the classroom is then actually continued after the class, and it's played on downtime. You know, soldiers, warfighters are taking games to deployment. They're, you know, the person with the Xbox when you're deployed in Iraq is the most popular person around. But yes, I think, you know, the centrality now of games, both analog and digital, to direct creation is yeah, there's an enormous crossover, I would say, absolutely.